Take coffee quickly, grab whatever else you need, and just have a seat. Okay, so our first speaker is here. This is Dr. Ferenbok.
Hello? Yeah, this one's on. Yeah, I don't know.
That one's just for the
okay.
live stream. So
all right. It's not lit up. Oh, maybe it is lit up. It is lit up. All right, I'm sorry to interrupt your break. And quite honestly, I was looking at the agenda for today. I was talking to Dave last week, and I was sort of thinking, what could I possibly contribute? It's an UnConference, an UnCon, and frankly, talking about the program we have and what we do didn't seem like what you want to do on a Saturday morning. And I was talking to my son this morning, and he's over there, and he said, never point at me because you'll embarrass me, Dad. How would dare you do that? But what would be useful for you? And one of the things he said, well, you know, what would be good for them? What would they want to take away? I don't like lecturing. I hate lecturing. I've done it for many decades now, I guess, but we don't lecture in our program. And so usually I like to talk to people. That's really not what this room is set up, so bear with me. So what I think I would like to do, if you guys are okay with it, I can frankly talk just about on any topic if you want, throw something out, but I thought what might be interesting is to think about creativity. I think that's the one thing that many of us have in common, and as I age and get older and I get accused of making dad jokes that aren't funny, I start thinking about how do we stay creative? How do we stay fresh? Because the reality is, as human beings, one of our greatest superpowers is that we think in patterns. And the thing that we do is we take those patterns and we use them to understand the world around us. So if you realize that, what it is that all of our new information becomes relative to what we already know. And as we get older, those ruts of thinking, those ways of understanding the world get deeper and deeper. And it's harder and harder to come up with something new. And it's harder and harder to think innovatively and differently. And you can think about this as the myths we live by in semiotics, those structures, the ways we understand, the visual myths, the language that all of you talk about in science, the standardization of the cell, the standardization of the ways we talk is in fact in huge tension with becoming creative and open and novel. And the more you work and the more you do one thing, the more likely you are to keep doing that thing. And eventually there'll be somebody else that's younger and newer and thinks differently and all of a sudden more creative, and you feel like, oh my God, what do I do now? Is that okay? Can we talk about creativity? Who here is worried about creativity? Who has ever had like this, you're sitting there and you need to come up with something, and no matter what you sketch, no matter what you do, it's the same thing. And it's just not good enough. Who has had that? Okay. What do you do about it? Take a shower. You know what? Great. Get yourself out of the context. Absolutely fabulous. Anyone else? Sorry?
Talk to my friends.
Okay, so excellent. Any? Time is great, but that doesn't necessarily mean that any of these strategies help you think differently, help you break out of some of your cognitive biases. So let's talk about art. I think, unless anyone disagrees, this is art, right? Anyone disagree? Fine art, high art? Well, technically, this is light projected on a screen, and it's not at all art. It's a representation of something you may think of as art because I'm triggering your own cognitive bias. This is art, right? Okay, all in agreement. Why is this art? Think about it, I'm very serious. Why is this art?
It's still an expression of thought.
An expression of thought. An expression of thought. Is art an expression of thought? That was a thought I just had. Must be art.
That depends where you are too. People could pay money just to say that.
Possibly. I don't really entirely agree, but sure. Never happened to me. Context, though.
Because it could be something doing something that's entirely different from what everyone else is doing for the first time, or like at an early stage, and other people.
Ooh. Did everyone hear that? Something that gets people to think differently, or to see differently, or to understand differently. Is that art? Pushing the boundaries. See, usually when I talk to people and when we are in groups, it's usually MD, PhDs, clinicians, scientists. You guys are supposed to be the creative ones. I don't hear you screaming at the top of your lungs. You know why this is art? It's in a museum. See in the background. It's in a museum. You must know it's art because it tells you it's art, the context. But you're absolutely right. The reason this ready-made by Duchamp was considered art and was caused such controversy because he picked up what is literally a urinal and put it in a museum. He challenged the way that people thought about art. That's creativity. So, although this is a crappy room for this, I want you to get near somebody else, and I want you in the next 2 minutes to think about this problem. I'm telling you 2 ways to solve this problem. What we can think of as horizontal thinking or lateral. I'm going to push you to the lateral. So, get near somebody. I don't hear anybody moving around. Come on, talk to the person next to you. 3 people. Hi.
I thought it was art.
Mm-hmm. It does depend on your perspective.
Someone from art, like this is not art, this is junk. Like someone.
All right, has anyone solved it? Okay, we have 2 solutions. Okay, I saw a hand over there. Go, solve it.
So you turn one light on, you turn the second light on, you wait a little while, you can turn that light off, and then you go into the garage. The light switch that's on is the light that's on. The light that is a little bit warm is the light that you turned on and off, and then the light that's off is the light bulb there.
So you've heard this before. So that is the antithesis of creativity. But thank you. So, interestingly enough, when I did this problem with others, I mean, did anyone come up with a different solution?
Get a friend to go in the garage and yell at you. And like,
Except that's, you are alone, it says somewhere. I thought about, you. And that's exactly it. One of the reasons I've had to revise this problem over and over again, because every time I do this, there's a different solution. So I've had the get a friend, shout really loud. I've had the use a cell phone, and actually place it and then stream. The problem with your solution that you came up with is two things. I tricked you purposely, because you've heard this before. What did you do?
I didn't think about it because I thought I already knew the answer.
Yeah. You see this? How many lights these days have this?
Not that many.
This, your solution, only works if it is not an LED light. If it is an LED light, the chances of you feeling heat is next to nothing. The reason this picture is here is partly intentional. It's a visual language to get you to think in terms of old school lighting, the heat. This is a way of sort of tricking your thinking. This is what you do. These are the things you should be aware of because this is your creativity. The visual language is what you speak. And how do you think differently about it? Well, my argument, and what I'm going to tell you that I genuinely do believe, is that creativity isn't about a lightning strike. It's not something that happens in a second. Pasteur used to say that luck favors those who are prepared of mind. Practice. Creativity is something you can actually think and train yourself to do. And those of you in a creative field should be doing that because of all people, this is your bread and butter, if I may use metaphors and mix them. You need to be thinking of ways of practicing and getting your mind to stay active, especially as you get older. How do you do that? How do you train your brain? Well, as it turns out, if you think about creativity as something other than a lightning strike, because usually what you see is the end result, and you think, okay, oh my God, that's brilliant. That over there, that urinal, to just pick some trash up and put it. But it wasn't an instantaneous kind of activity. You don't know all of the thought and work and stuff that came in before, and the situation and the context, and the many iterations that happened beforehand. Creativity is very much also a process. It is a way of doing things. It is a way of approaching problems to recognize patterns and to figure out how to challenge those established patterns and mix them up and how to rethink them. And there are ways to do this. So I'm going to get you again to do this together in groups. And I'll give you a minute because I don't know what my timeline is like. See this square? Square, visual people. I want you to find as many ways as possible to divide this square into 4 equal parts. 4 equal parts. Go. Draw, doodle, your visual, right? How much time do I have?
Okay, you guys have 5 minutes of it. So we start 10 minutes late, so about 10 minutes.
10 minutes.
Oh, I can cut. Well, okay, we'll talk. I'll give them another minute or two then. Okay, I'm told I have about 5 minutes-ish, so let's gather back. Finish your last couple thoughts. All right. All right. How many solutions did you come up with? Infinite. Okay. That's interesting. Four identical equal parts. They're equal. Same shape, so they're equal. Okay, so interestingly, let's debrief on this, because that's an interesting reflection. Why are you asking me that question after the exercise is over? Okay. But nobody, you are the free thinkers. Why did nobody put up their hand and say, excuse me, what are the constraints?
Well, I think because throughout our thought process we were breaking down.
Okay.
We don't think of that as first.
Sure, but I'm not saying you should have first at any point. Nobody asked. Creative thinkers ask questions. It's really important. Okay. So how many solutions did you get? There aren't infinite, actually, but sure. Well, I saw what you were pointing at. That doesn't work because they're not equal. It's a square. So the second you move off of the axis, okay, we'll see. Try it.
I think all of our first reactions to this problem were there are two answers. One, you can divide it like this, or you can divide it horizontally like this and like this. Exactly.
Okay. So most everybody that does this thinks about this problem like we think of every problem, and that's the point, in our most comfortable, most familiar ways of thinking. It is inevitable, and hopefully you got this from this way, that this is the easiest. Equal parts, 2 lines, broken down. Did everyone see this? Yeah. So any problem you approach, there's usually a typical way of seeing it. Because of your context, culture, upbringing, age, background experience, how you learned in school, what you ate for breakfast, all of that shapes your thinking. Okay. Did anyone approach this in a different way? At the back.
So we got like they're a square, we cut it in half, and then we would make like symmetrical, like either just like that, or like that, like a straight line now, like a diagonal line, like a curved line. So then, yeah.
Okay. So that's really, really great, because that's the second way you can be creative, is find a way to break down the problem so that you have subsets, a structure to think about any one problem in a systematic way. So in this case, one way to do this kind of thinking is to break the square up into its component pieces. The analogy to this is when you have a design problem and you have it stated in a particular way, how can you break up the assumptions, the domain? How can you break down the question or what it is you're going to? What are the constituent parts? What are the assumptions being made? How can you systematically fragment, deconstruct the problem so that you can reconstruct it or look at it from different perspectives? So if you were to do this, you could simply take this problem and systematically approach it by changing the shape and changing the different grid system. And what you essentially get are really 4 other ways quickly to break this problem down. So that is less typical of an approach because it tends to be not the first cliche, I guess I shouldn't call it cliche, just the first go-to thing we think about. This becomes, okay, here's my first brainstorming session. Now, what can I do to think about this problem in a systematic way so that I can look at different alternatives? Because the key to creativity actually isn't necessarily coming up with the one new way of thinking about it. It's generating as many ideas as you possibly can and then looking at different options. So this is another way systematically to generate ideas. But there's a problem. Can anyone spot the problem with this? I think I'm done with the clicker. Oh, the computer's something about power. Well, the problem is, if you remember our initial setup, right away, this systematic approach at problem solving precludes the triangle. So, what are alternative ways? Now you start thinking about, okay, if you're trying to broaden your way of thinking and you're trying to approach a problem systematically, what are the cliche way of thinking? How can I systematically approach this way of thinking? Now, what are the problems that I haven't been able to capture with my systematic way? So now we're talking about asymmetrical ways of approaching the problem. That you're still getting the 4 equal parts, but now it is not within your system. So in a sense, it's actually really a quite simple way of brainstorming. What's the typical answer? How can I come up with other answers in a systematic way? And what other answers do I not capture by my systematic approach? Addressing a problem from that perspective hopefully can generate multiple options for you so that then you can be creative about what you choose as your next step and what might be appropriate for where you're going with your design. So some of the strategies that I like to talk and think about in terms of problem solving and creative problem solving, this is on all the time, are things like this. So first, practice. And what I mean by practice is do things that go beyond your everyday. Go beyond where you're comfortable. Try something that you haven't done before. Try it for once a week, for an hour. Challenge yourself with something different. It's a way of just keeping you active. Try to unlearn things. And what I mean by that is, in some of our workshops, for example, we challenge our students to go out and rethink the coffee experience. Assume you know nothing. You've landed on Earth for the first time and you're an alien. You don't know what coffee is. Unlearn your cognitive biases. Try to put them aside. Challenge your own assumptions so that you can look or try and look as best as you can from different perspectives on the same problem. Embrace failure. In fact, we haven't tested this yet, but I hope to someday soon. I want to start running workshops where the whole purpose initially is to design something that fails. So get it out of the way. design something that you know absolutely for sure, for a fact, it's going to be bad. And that's the challenge. Then go back and say, this is a failure. Why is it a failure? What could be done to this to make this better? And iteratively improve from that point on. You take away all the risk of looking silly or starting and looking at something that doesn't work. Start with something that doesn't work. Assume it doesn't work. What can you do to change and improve it? We actually don't learn if we don't fail. Generate multiple alternatives. One of the key things initially in being creative and brainstorming is look at all options. You never know what stupid thing, what complete throwaway idea might trigger something in your mind or somebody else's mind that leads to a different direction or different pattern. So at first, it's really important, in my opinion, the opinions of many other people, is to just not judge. Quality is not as important at first as quantity. Different quantity, and then select for quality. Collaborate. Someone said it, talk to your friends. We all think differently. Try and find as many different kind of people to surround yourself with so that you can get different ideas, different approaches, different way of looking at things. We're very lucky. Diversity is amazing for creativity, because if you put, and this is the standard line I use in our sessions, if you put a whole bunch of physicians in a room and ask them to solve a problem, they are more likely to come up with common solutions than if you put a whole bunch of interprofessional people in the same room with the same problem. They are much more likely to come up with a diversity of approaches. Fractionate the problem. So if we had more time, we could talk about how do you break down problems in terms of both semiotically, cognitively, what do you understand, how it revolves, how it is rhetorically positioned, what are the pieces, what are the assumptions, how can you reconfigure those assumptions to look at it from a different perspective. And those sorts of exercises are things you can Google, brainstorming exercises, play with one, get a group of your friends, 4 or 5 people, once a week for an hour, take a project, brainstorm it. Just get used to different kinds of ideas. And the other way is to reframe the problem space. So quite often, if you change some of the constraints, all of a sudden you start thinking differently. And that's one way. For example, the pill camera that we now have actually comes from a bomb, guided missile engineering. It was used in the medical frame instead of war because somebody had the idea, hey, I can use this same technology in a different context. So thinking outside of a particular domain or frame can help you think creatively. There are lots of strategies out there. There are lots of things. But my takeaway that I hope you think about is that you have to invest in yourself. You have to invest in your brain. You have to train your brain to keep creative and challenge yourself and to keep thinking differently so that you don't get stuck in your own ruts and cognitive biases, so that you can find ways to be and continue to be creative. Do we have time or any questions? Okay. Okay.
Christine, and she will be presenting on designing for decisions in the healthcare system.
Do you want to use this? You need this on for the recording, so that has to come on. Yeah. If you want to talk through the podium, or you can talk through this, depending on how you feel comfortable. I just need this, but you need this one. So what's this one?
play? Will I just go to
Yeah,
presenter?
if you play, it should just... Cool.
Okay. Hi, my name is Christine, and today I'm going to talk to you about design and healthcare. So I'm going to go over some of the challenges and opportunities that are in this space, and I think you'll see that these are challenges that we see commonly as visual communicators. But I'll start by giving you some background. So, hi, I graduated from BMC in 2017, and after leaving BMC, I was hired by CCO to start their information design practice. And now when I tell people this, I get two questions. The first is, what's CCO? Like, that's not Bridgeable, that's not Access, where are you? And the second question is, what exactly is information design? You know, that's not that doesn't quite sound like medical illustration, though it might have some similarities. So I'll start with addressing the first. CCO is a healthcare agency, and as you may or may not know, healthcare in Canada is governed provincially. This means that in Ontario, the Ministry of Health is responsible for administering our healthcare system. But it doesn't do this alone. It works with a number of different agencies, and one of those agencies is CCO. So CCO used to stand for Cancer Care Ontario because it was primarily focused on the cancer care side of the system. Since then, it's expanded to also look at other areas such as renal care, access to care, palliative care, and a number of other areas. And one of the roles that CCO plays is to analyze data on the healthcare system and advise the provincial government on how to improve the system. So it's more geared toward, in some of its work, it's more geared toward the administrative side of healthcare. So what does information design have to do with this? Well, essentially, I work with data, and I try to find ways to communicate this to people so they can make better informed decisions. So this encompasses a number of different fields, such as data visualization, information organization, interface design, user engagement, and testing. At the end of the day, I'm still a visual communicator, but the difference is that my focus is primarily with data. I'll show you some examples of what this work tends to look like. So one type of project I commonly work on is in developing interactive tools. So let's say we have a large data set of a particular area of the healthcare system, and we do our analyses and we figure out what the key relationships are, what are the key things that we think people should know about this data. I'll work with analysts to figure out how we should communicate this, so maybe what charts or graphs we should use. But when it comes to sharing this information, I don't just want to hand over a stack of charts and say, here's the information. We want to package it in a way so that people can receive this information and be able to focus on areas that are most important to them. So we might build an interface, and we'll work out what kinds of filtering options or sorting options are important for this audience, what type of contextual information do we need to include, what kind of references or methodology notes should we add in. And this will go as far as implementation, so down to the details of the interface. What does a button look like? What does the navigation look like? Another type of project I might work on is static reporting. So this is one recent project I worked on was a redesign of an existing report. So let's say we have information that's going out a couple times a year. Once in a while, we might want to assess, is this working? Can we improve on our current solutions? So I might start by taking a project and considering how is the information organized. Can we improve on how the structure works? When someone receives this information, are they able to quickly and easily identify whether the content they care about is in this report and how to find it? I might then assess how is the data currently communicated, and can we improve on that communication? So this can be simple things like changing charts to be more effective. It can also be in questioning, is there information that we could be sharing but we aren't yet? So let's say I'm looking at some measurement. So let's say I'm comparing hospitals. I might ask the question, is it important for our audience to know where these hospitals are geographically located? Will that add additional insights that aren't currently being expressed? And of course, after we come up with our design, there's a final kind of polish, making it nice and aesthetically pleasing. A third type of work I might do is more exploratory. So sometimes we'll have a data set that's complex, hard to communicate, and I'll explore different options of, what are ways of communicating this. Let's say a simple bar chart or a line chart isn't quite cutting it. It's still too messy. We need to work on more creative solutions. Or maybe it's not that the data set itself is complicated, but we're not sure what to do with it yet. So I might prototype what kind of narratives can we tell with this information? Can we design a dashboard or other solutions that will help us find some insights? And we might even prototype, how might this be implemented? What will the look and feel be? What kinds of interactions do we imagine people having with this? And so those are all great projects to work on, but they do have their own challenges. So the first challenge I want to talk about has to do with data. The question is, what's the data we're working with? What are we trying to share? And this question goes both ways. It's not just what data are we sharing, but what data are we withholding? And this is important because in healthcare especially, there's a big concern around privacy. We don't want to share personal health information with someone unless they have explicit authorization and reason to be seeing it. And so whenever I'm working on a piece and we're sharing data, we're asking ourselves, is there anything identifying in this data set? Is there information that we should be suppressing? And not just what are we sharing, but is there any opportunity for unexpected use cases? So if I send this data out, could someone back calculate and figure out and identify an individual from it? And so there's some kind of caution and constraint around what data we put out there. The second type of challenge we have has to do with development. Now, if I were to ask you, what is your ideal design process? If you were to sit down and start a project, how would you want it to go? You might say something like, well, I'll start by kind of doing research, understanding the context. I'll interview my users, get to know them, maybe make a persona, some scenarios, journey mapping. I might do some then wireframing, some testing, iteration, implementation, prototyping, some more testing, some more iteration, get all the feedback I need, and then I'll get sign off, and it'll be great, all on time, within budget. But I think sometimes things don't go quite exactly the way you plan. There may be one or two hiccups along the way. And in my experience of going through this design process is often the trickiest part of it is getting the users when you want them and as often as you want them. And this is really what informs our design. It's knowing who we're making it for, what their prior knowledge is, how they learn things, what their numerical or visual literacy is. And we need this, but it can be hard to get. Sometimes your users maybe live in a rural area and you can't get them in person. Or maybe they're very busy, or they're not accustomed to being part of the design process. And so how do we address this challenge of knowing our audience? The third challenge I want to talk about is this concept of decision making. So when I share data, it's for the purpose of informing choices. But I need to ask, is it doing that? Does data inform? And some people will say, well, of course data informs. Data is data. It's objective. It's factual. Some would say that if you want to present information or present data, just show the data, and the data will speak for itself. But if you think about it, data is pretty biased. There's bias in how data is collected, what data is excluded in that collection, how it's analyzed, and even when I sit down to present data, I am encouraging a particular interpretation by my visualization. So there's a lot of subjectivity that goes into how data is shared. And one of the questions that come out of this is, well, we're sharing data to inform decisions, but whose job is it to make the final interpretation? Who makes the final call on this? And on one end of the spectrum, you might say that, well, it's the audience who makes the final choice. So they're the ones who are making the decision, and they should be making the interpretation. So maybe one approach would be to just give the audience that power. Give them all the data, let them do all the filtering they want, all the sorting they want. They can essentially do the analyses that matter to them, and it's in their hands. We'll just do a data dump. There, you have it. You can do whatever you want with it. On the other extreme, we might say that, well, no, as the people who have analyzed the data, we should just do that work for our audience and say, limit what we give out. Don't confuse our audience. Just say, the answer is 42. You don't need to know anything else. And these are kind of two extremes that try to answer the question of who is responsible for interpretation. And so I've framed these three things, data development and decisions, as challenges, but they can also be seen as opportunities we have. When it comes to data, and particularly data privacy, it's true that it's a constraint, and we need to be cautious around what data we share and how it might be used. But if you think about it, if I'm sharing information to someone who doesn't have authorization for individual level health information, who's only meant to see aggregate level or population level information, then really that's a level of scale that matters to that person. That's a level of detail that has value. And so this kind of constraint really forces me to question, am I sharing this data just because I have it, or just for the sake of sharing it, or just because I think it's interesting? Or is it really serving my communication goal? And so restricting what data we share and what data we keep can actually improve the value of our communication. The second challenge of development is, as I mentioned, sometimes it's hard to access our audience. And sometimes you can't use your preferred methods of maybe seeing your audience in person or using quite the techniques you like the most. But that's OK, I think, because there is no one-size-fits-all solution. The approaches we take may change by the project we're on, the user groups we're with, the teams we work with. And what's good is that it can stretch our processes and our ways of approaching different challenges. So for example, if you're working with a user group that lives in a rural area, you might explore different methods of engaging them. You might try remote testing or things like that. If you're working with someone who isn't accustomed to being part of the design process, this might be an opportunity to learn and share different approaches. And as well, one thing I've found as I worked across different teams and on different projects is sometimes you try an approach with a particular user group and you find, well, that didn't work quite as well as I thought it might, but I have an idea of what might work better next time. And so even our design approaches themselves can go through some iteration. The third question of decision making and who's responsible for interpreting things at the end of the day. On one hand, we have the overly complex, other hand, overly simplistic solutions. And most of the time, we want something probably in the middle. We want analysis, but with guidance. We want to give data, but also context and advice. And if we know our information and we know what we're communicating, we should give some guidance on how it should be read. Of course, at the end of the day, it's our audience who makes the choice. We can't make choices on behalf of our users, but we can advise them. We can communicate the information we think is most important. And it can be hard sometimes to find this balance between how much freedom or how much information to give and how much kind of hand-holding to put in. But I think that's not just a challenge we have, it's an opportunity. It's a fun challenge we have as communicators to find this balance. This is our craft, is to know what, in the end, it matters to communicate. So these three things, data development and decisions, are really challenges that cut across all the visual communication fields. Data is the question of content. What are we trying to communicate? Development is the question of process and audience. Who are we making this for, and how are we going to do it? And decision making is the question of goal. Why are we making our communications, and is our work achieving its purpose? And so I'll close by asking one final question, which is, what is the value of design in healthcare? I would say that in particular for information design, there's a lot of messy and complexities in the healthcare space. And there's a lot of opportunity here to analyze and understand and effectively communicate this information to inform better decision making so we can build a better health system. Thank you. Okay.
Are there any questions for Christine?
Yeah.
Quick question. How do you see information design being, let's say, adapted to other domains where data is important to, like, for instance, public education or, yeah, I guess that's one domain.
I think information design can apply to a lot of different spaces, just because in general in our society we are seeing data being used more and more as a currency and as a way of communication. And so, in some fields we say that, data is the way to communicate a point or to clarify information. Sometimes that's augmented by other things like illustration or other ways of visual communication, but I do think it will increasingly grow as one approach we use in communicating.
This is something that,
Yeah.
This is something that needs to be sold a bit more, I guess, in other domains as opposed to in public healthcare, where I'm presuming it's more of an established role, or how would you?
Yeah, I mean, I would say that for sure in certain fields it's assumed that you need to have data because there are areas where you need the numbers. You it's like, for example, in my field, it's very data heavy. We need to know exactly how to compare different healthcare metrics. And in other areas, it may or may not be as necessary, but I think it still adds a lot of value. And I think it will grow. People will expect it more and more as we lean more and more on the data we're collecting. Yeah.
I'm just curious about, I guess, your everyday role at CCO. So do you find yourself interacting more with, do you work with data scientists, or do you also interact with healthcare admin and consulting with their decisions, or how do you find that interplay between? Because I guess assuming really technical communication is also communicating for healthcare administration.
Yeah, so I'd say my role is pretty broad right now. I work across many different teams in my organization, and each team runs itself a little differently. So in some, I work with the analysts or the statisticians, or sometimes I'm more involved in a bigger piece of the process. Other times I'm more focused on kind of a signal slot in the development. Yeah, there's no one answer to what my day looks like because it varies based on kind of which team I'm on. So I have a bit of a more consultant role in my company. Yeah. Great. Thank you.